So, are you new to the hobby or are you wanting to change scales and trying to figure out what the best scale or gauge is for you? Well, in this video, we're going to look at some of the factors that will help you determine what scale or gauge might be the best one for you. Okay, so before I present to you my ultimate half-baked guide to choosing a scale, I want to note a few important points. So first of all, there is no best scale and gauge of model trains, and I mean, besides N scale, but there is probably one or two scales that might be the best ones for you. Anyway, there are a lot of scales and gauges available, and so I'm not going to look at all of the less popular ones like S scale, because if you are new to the hobby, those probably aren't good places to start because there isn't as much available. I'm also assuming here you're looking at building a layout indoors and not really building a layout outside in the garden. If you're doing that, probably G-gauge is the best way to go. The bigger trains are just going to hold up better to the outdoor conditions. I'm also ignoring narrow gauge trains in this video, just not to overcomplicate things. And as a note there, gauge refers to the distance between the rails on the track, while scale is the actual size of the equipment relative to reality. So HO scale is 1/87th scale, so 1 inch in HO scale is the same as 87 inches in real life, or 1 centimeter to 87 centimeters, of reality. Now, O gauge trains encompass both O scale trains and other scales that run on an O gauge track, and the same thing is true for G gauge. Many different scales run on G gauge track. Anyway, without further ado, here is my half-baked guide to choosing a scale. But before I go through this, you might notice I don't include the cost here at all. While smaller scales are indeed cheaper than larger scales on a per item basis, for any given size space, you're going to use a lot less stuff in O scale than you will in HO or N scale. And so as a result, the total cost for building a layout of a given size may not be as different as you think. So anyway, let's dive into my half-baked guide here. So first off, the biggest question I think is, can you work with a small scale or not? If N scale or smaller is just too small for you to work with, maybe your eyes just aren't good enough to see things in scales that small at this point in your life, or you just have a really hard time working with really small things, then write those off and let's assume you need a bigger scale. So let's look here. Do you need or want long mainline runs, or are you mostly interested in switching operations? So if you really just like to see trains run, then the question becomes, do you have a lot of space or not? If you don't, and you can't use a smaller scale, then you should be in HO scale. If you do have a lot of space and you want to see a lot of long trains run, then the question is, do you want the scenery to dominate the trains? If you want to have majestic mountain scenery with dominating the size of the trains, then go with HO scale so you can get that scenery to train ratio that you want. But if that's not important for you, then the next question I think is, are you focused more on having fun, or are you really more focused on trying to create the most realistic and scale railroad that you can with your money? And if that's the most important thing, is having everything true to scale, having the best detailed variety of structures available to buy and that kind of thing, then HO scale is going to be your best bet, because you can find all kinds of Craftsman kits, perfectly scaled models of everything, whereas you can't always do that with O scale. But if you are mostly about the fun, you don't care if the scale's off a little bit of this item or that item, and maybe everything's not exactly the same scale, then go ahead and use O scale, because the sheer size of it does allow you to have really great sound. You can do a lot of animation and things like that in O scale that you can't do as well in the smaller scales. I mean, sure, HO has sound, but it's not the same as that thunderous sound you get on an O gauge locomotive. So there's definite advantages on the fun side with the bigger scales that you go with. Well, now let's assume that really you're more interested in switching operations. Then it becomes a little bit more interesting as well, because if you have a lot of space, well, You can obviously go ahead and just do O scale because again, you're going to have trains that are more massive, they have great sound, and that can make switching more enjoyable. But if you don't have a lot of space, you might think you should automatically go with HO scale, but that's not necessarily the case. Really what it comes down to is how long of an operating session do you want to be able to run? So I'm building a small door-sized O scale layout here later this year. It'll basically be roughly on a 24-inch by 80-inch door. I'll probably extend it maybe half a foot or something. But that will give me a half-hour long operating session every time I want to run that railroad. If that's what is good enough for you, then go ahead and use O scale in a small space, and you can still have a lot of fun. But if you want to have the most number of industries to switch, the longest operating session you can possibly have for your size, then you should go with HO scale. Now let's look at those smaller scales. Now assuming that you're in smaller scales to maximize what you can do in your space, whether it's a small space or a big space, the question again becomes, do you want to see trains run, or are you more interested in operations? Now if you are into operations and you don't want to have a real frustrating time trying to couple and uncouple Z-scale equipment, at industries, or maybe you're trying to reach in and it's hard to see what you're doing and everything is really small, and every time you try to uncouple a car, you knock it off the track. If you don't want to deal with that, probably you should be in N scale. But if you're mostly interested in long trains running and you just want to run long trains, then maybe a smaller scale can be better for you than N scale. So then the question becomes, are you looking for specific equipment? Do you want that BLI big boy that has sound and smoke and looks really amazing? Well, you're going to have to go in N scale for that because you're not going to be getting that in Z scale or smaller. So then the question becomes, do you care at all about what you're running? If you're really trying to find certain road names and things like that, but you want to maximize your train length, then go with Z scale because it's smaller than N scale. You can longer trains in the same space, have longer trackage in terms of the scale miles of track in the same space with Z scale, and have really great looking scenery and have those long trains run on your desktop if you want. So that could be the option for you. But if you just want long trains, you don't care what's running on the track, and you have a small space and you want to have like a 20-car train running, on your desktop in a small little display, well, you might even look at T-gauge. And in fact, I'm going to be doing that here in a few weeks. I did order some T-gauge equipment, and we're going to take a look at it and see if it's even feasible to do anything with it. But anyway, that's something to keep in mind. Whether you're looking at Z or N or Z instead of Z, depending on where you're from, or HO scale or O scale, looking at what's available can be an important deciding factor. Typically, HO scale, you can find anything, maybe not currently, but you can find it either used or it'll be coming out again in the next year or two often. As you go to the other scales, availability diminishes generally. N scale is not quite to HO scale, but it's close. O scale has a lot of availability, but it's not always available all the time. So Lionel will do a run and then, they may do something similar again in a few years. And so you can't always get everything at any given time, but there is a lot of availability still in O scale. As you get to Z scale, availability does diminish. There's surprisingly a lot available in Z scale, more than you'd probably think. But again, it's not going to be as much as N scale or HO scale. So those are things to keep in mind when you're trying to pick the best scale and gauge for your trains. But anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.